Welcome everyone to this week's IPLD sync meeting. It's exit full screen. It's July the 5th, 2021. And as every 2 weeks, we go over the stuff that people worked on IPLD and then discuss any open agenda items. I can't start with myself because I haven't done any IPLD work. So next on my list is Danielle.
Cool. So I don't have that much to report because I did spend the majority of the last couple of weeks working on CarV2. But I can give some high-level overview of that. Essentially, this week we're finishing the API. Most of the major features are there. And by major features, I mean what Will worked on in the separate two repos. We're kind of just putting things together here. Something of note in the IPLD sense is that I worked on an API in GoCID called CID from reader, because there's an API currently in master called CID from bytes, and it only consumes the amount of bytes that are necessary for the CID, but it only works if you have the buffer already in memory. If you have a reader and you don't know how many bytes there are in the reader, you couldn't really do that until now. So there's a pull request open if anybody wants to review it. And also as an FYI, and I meant this for Rod mainly, but I guess I'll ping him on this afterwards. But it turns out that Filecoin has been using a commit off of GoCar in some dead branch that doesn't exist anymore, that was forked off like a year ago. And what that commit did was it allowed null padding, i.e. 0 bytes at the end of a CarV1. And the reader essentially ignored those. And we do have a similar thing in CarV2. It allows for padding after the CarV1 and before the index, but it's different. When you read a CarV1, it expects that to end with the OF. It doesn't do anything with null bytes. But the spec does leave that somewhat open as a door, because it's a sequence of frames. So what do you do when you reach a CarV1 frame that's length 0? Do you skip it? Do you assume that that's ZOF? It's sort of up for interpretation. So we agreed that the implementation should skip those and just keep on parsing. But in that issue, I outlined that I think we should change the CarV1 spec to essentially say a decoder, once it encounters a null frame, is free to assume that that's an AOF to stop parsing, because that would allow us to essentially be efficient. Because right now we have to keep parsing every single byte as a variant, which is really slow. If we decide not to do that, then the plan B is to take a shortcut, like read 4K nulls at a time and just quickly skip over those, assuming that there's no non-zero bytes. But if we can avoid that, that would be nice. It's just a matter of the spec.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very fair to say that once you start hitting these null bytes, you're not going to put valid CIDs after it, and that when you're encoding, that you shouldn't be actually interleaving an encoded null SID with your real data. That can go at the end if you need to reference it somehow. But
even if it's a null SID, it will still have a length. So the length itself is still a thing. So yeah, it doesn't matter.
Yep, I agree. I essentially want to.
So that seems very reasonable.
Yeah, essentially, like the addition to the spec that I want to do should be as small as possible, and I think it should be like you can have some padding, but as soon as the reader gets a null byte, that's where it ends. And aside from that, I've been sort of putting the IPLD reflection in bind node to the side for the last couple of weeks, just because of the CarV2 work. But it's still in the same state as I reported last time, which is that I was working on inferring schemas from Go types. And that's still a work in progress. It's not super difficult, but I just need to focus on it. And next week I'm off, but the week after I'm on stewards. So I expect to do some other kinds of stuff. And that's it for now.
Thanks. although I haven't done any work on IPLD, it might still be interesting for the call that there is a bit of development going on in Go store the hash. So if you're interested in storing things by CID, basically IPLD data, it might be interesting to look at because it now has support for also updates and deletes, which it previously didn't have. Yeah, it's also linked in the notes. And hopefully there will be more development going into this. So stay tuned. Does anyone have anything else?
I think that's a lot of the active work I'm aware of. I guess the other thing that I threw up randomly as a very early attempt at understanding sort of, I don't know if I want to say compromises, but shortcuts that get us faster to more functionality is around how we have selectors and ADLs playing nicely together. We have a lot of data that involves ADLs. All of our IPFS data is actually understood through a UnixFS ADL that runs on top of the sort of underlying DAG-PP baseline. That is how those SIDs are actually encoded. And in Filecoin, we're making a lot of use of HAMPs where we can shard large maps of data. And we're expecting, I think, that we need some sort of recommendation of how to pack data meaningfully as we start having these large 32 gig chunks of data. And I think we expect that, you know, in terms of things that we have sane libraries and support and tooling for, HAMPs and or the UnixFS things are likely going to persist for a while. And so it'd be really nice if we had useful ways to do selectors that worked with them. And that seems like if we sort of don't do anything special, that may be a ways off. But one thing you could imagine is in a selector, you could, at the point that you're at a node, say, interpret this node as an ADL, and we can make a registered map, as we have done with many other things, of known ADLs that we expect there to be implementations of. And then we can say, we expect, you know, people evaluating selectors in this context to know at least what HAMPs and UnixFS are. And now there's a way in a relatively compact selector to do a selection where you do it as a logical selector over the HAMP rather than having to know the actual structure of the HAMP in that thing in advance. So I'm trying to think, because adding that to the selector implementation looks like it won't actually be too much work on first glance. And so I'm trying to understand, A, if there's things that cause us to be reluctant to do this. Does it cause us to feel like we're shooting ourselves in the foot? Are there issues with potential, I don't know, complexity, or like this leads to some sort of weird unbounded application of ADLs in a way that we can't like back out of it or end up doing more work than we were anticipating in evaluating selectors that we get scared of. The other one that I thought I was thinking of as I started going here is, let's say you've got data that is in a codec that you don't understand necessarily, or in a schema that you don't understand. So not, I guess not a codec, but a schema per se. So, you know, one thing we could imagine doing as our path to allowing a entity to do a selection over data where some of it is in schemas they don't understand is the selector could point in sort of a similar way to a SID that is data of the IPLD schema. And then when you get told use this type of node, you load the IPLD schema and parse it into a schema, which we need our schema to be finished, but we could then do, and then we could use my node to actually get the schema generated off of that. And then we could use that as the thing that we use as our node assembler to pull into. So you could potentially have a not needing full sort of VMs or something totally crazy. And I think relatively concrete path where you could allow data that's stored in arbitrary codecs to end up being a basis for selection over, with the like caveat that you would have to sort of note it in the selectors. So you end up with longer selectors and overloaded selectors a little bit, but there's, I think, you know, the potential, if we give up on the selectors, are agnostic to all of these other things, that can be a place that we can provide some hints and potentially get a lot of the functionality that we've been hoping for, but sort of see as a long way off to pull up to be things that we can start doing much sooner. You have comments, Dan?
Yeah, and this is, I raised my hand very early on when you were talking. So what I was thinking is—
now you get to react to all of it.
You know that thing where you start talking and then I have a thought about it. So I start thinking to myself, and then I notice that I haven't been listening to you for 30 seconds. So I'm kind of lost for the rest of the, but I was thinking something along the lines of what Peter was saying, which is that ADLs are not really a canonical central registry of behavior. And if you look at, for example, just Filecoin, they have the HAMT, but they have a HAMT that behaves in one way with some parameters in the older actors version, I guess you would call it, and then the newer one with different parameters. So how would you represent all of that with just, canonical strings?
That's a great question. My first response is we say the IPLD HAMT in, so there's two things. We're doing this only for reading in the context of selectors. And I think you don't actually need the things like bit width on the read-only thing because it's actually encoded in the nodes. If I understand correctly. No?
Not in the Filecoin nodes, no. The root with the parameters is not in the Filecoin HAMT. It's only in the proper IPLD HAMT.
Nor it is in the UNIXFS directory, if I remember correctly. What
so it's only
is working on.
Right, so it's in the UNIXFS HAMT, right? The UNIXFS HAMT node does include the things that you need, where it's not parameterized if you do the full IPLD HAMT. Like if I was to open and say interpret this as an IPLD HAMT, I could do that, and I don't need to pass in other parameters at that point, I think, for reading.
I don't recall, actually. Need to double check.
So that was that was going to be my initial proposal. Was I think there is a version of HAMT where you can just say that, and the root node of the HAMT will have enough to do the hashing properly. And if that's true, then we'd say that's the one that we're going to standardize. And because this is only going to apply to data like stored, so like backwards compatibility to change state that's not actually stored as deals, I care way less about for this context. Like we're not doing selectors over Filecoin chain state. That's not what this is trying to enable, right? This is miners are getting arbitrary data. And then, I know that some aggregator stored a bunch of files either with a HAMT or with UNIXFS, and I want to logically say, give me file named X out of this UNIXFS directory, or I want to get, the item keyed whatever out of the HAMT that the guy stored without necessarily retaining the top level information of it was stored at, child 5 of child 7 of child 3, and having to store the metadata of that sort of, I don't know, not pertinent to my interests HAMT part.
So my reaction to this is that, I instantly jumped to what Hannah implemented as her proto UNIXFS ADL, which effectively, it didn't support HAMT originally, and effectively it was a very specialized hard-coded select, like JQ level select over Go Merkle tag. And it feels to me that jumping straight into ATLs and not implementing the simpler thing, which is the select, which is actually, universal and agnostic. Like I want a thing that looks like this other thing, and then I want to continue, like literally the way JQ does it. We are going to not fill out the best of, so to speak, curve, because there is going to be a lot of stuff that can be done that happens to be just weird enough. Like somebody maybe did stuff with some I don't know, like in my experience, I effectively never run into HAMTs, and I explicitly never produce sharded directories. I basically have no problem saying like, oh, this thing is just too big. We have limitations, just like there are file systems that we have 256 entries per directory, and that's that, and that's fine. And if I cannot like represent it, I'm just not going to represent it. I'm going to do some workarounds or something like that. And in general, in order to get the directory into hemp territory, you are looking at like I don't remember exactly the numbers, but it was something like on the order of 10,000 entries or something like that. So I feel that we are like chasing this not even 1%, like 0.1% of the cases with full-blown ADLs, whereas a simple select selector would get us like quite far without, and will remain universal effectively. So.
Cool. I mean, if this isn't a real problem that you're running up against, great. Less work to try and pull up, but we can revisit when we start getting more complaints, I guess, or more consternation around this.
Like the reason that my retrieval POC works the way it works, and like after I presented on the retrieval markets thing, retrieval market builders thing, I got like 4 or 5 questions like, oh, when will it do stuff by name? And I'm like, well, it can't do stuff by name because we don't have selects. But the only reason I'm doing it with integers is because we effectively have only pathing selectors. Go here and then go here and then go here. And I don't know, like from my perspective, an ADL is like overkill for what is actually like the immediate need. Daniel?
I'm thinking to myself, and this might be like too generic, but Will was talking about things that you get from miners, and then they're useful when you use them through an ADL, not directly through the data model. Do we have any way of attaching metadata to say, hey, by the way, this data is meant to be used by this particular ADL? Because if that context is already built in, then I wouldn't need to specify it by default, supposedly. Like if I store
Attach where though? Like as part of your deal or as part?
Well, that's where I throw my hands in the air and I say, has anybody designed anything like this?
Not that I'm aware of. So you could imagine that the link, when you have a link to another SID, you could potentially indicate an ADL at that point. That might be a place. So rather than just a direct SID link, you could have a SID plus ADL link.
Yeah, in a way, it's like a multi-codec, I guess. It's just like a level above, right? It's not how you decode it; it's how you use it.
I mean, in CBOR, you can do multi-tags. Not only 42, but depending on 42 and something else gives you the codec of what this thing points to, or something like that. That's crazy, of course, but yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways we could potentially do this, I guess, is the high level thing. But it's something to think about, because I suspect at some point we realize that we really do want some way to allow for this.
Yeah,
but I think that's the only thing beyond. I don't know. We haven't done anything for IPLD and IPFS in the last couple of weeks, but that should start up again fairly soon, optimistically. Now that IPFS 0.9 is shipped finally, that was sort of what we were waiting for. We now can get some of Adin's time back and use that to get the IPLD Prime stuff through. So that's exciting. I'm sort of like paging back in since the last time this call happened. I made a variant of the DAG JSON codec because there was a thing I wanted that it wouldn't do, and that was I wanted to dump JSON for debugging purposes. And namely, I had roughly a 3-level deep IPLD node that had a link to another IPLD node. And I just wanted that whole DAG as a JSON thing. And so if I was to dump it with DAG JSON, I would just get a SID to the secondary node, and I wouldn't get the whole DAG. And so I made a variant called dump JSON, which is exactly the same thing as DAG JSON, except it does not require a SID link as the explicit typecast. I will only deal with links called SID link, which has been somehow hard coded into the DAG JSON codec. But instead, it will take any link and it will just print out what the link tells it to. And then I made an immediate link, which is a link that contains the node that it points to, and then just recurses on it. So it does an inline printing of whatever the link is to. And that's just a different link system, right? Like a bunch of the pieces of IPLD prime machinery actually do work reasonably well in allowing for this sort of adaptation. But we had a hard code that I need to point to the working example of this and see if I can convince Eric to allow the less hard-coded version in the official DAG JSON, so I don't need a different codec as well.
Could you do this by wrapping your, so I assume you have a node that you're printing with this. Can you not wrap it in, could we not have a wrapper node that's like link flattener or something like that? And it just resolves the links. And instead of having CIDs, it just has the children nodes directly in there. So then you can use any codec like that.
Would I have to make another whole schema thing that's the same schema, but without the link and direct, because this is a schema node?
It doesn't matter if it's just a node layer on top of your node. It doesn't really matter what the node is implemented by, as long as it's the interface, right?
It's true, but it's okay. So then what tooling to do that? Because that seems like more programming changes to make the thing that interprets this map and finds all values that are links in a recursive way and skips them.
It would be quite a bit of code, but I guess the advantage is that you write it once. So it's like a flattener for any node, and it works for any codec. So I'm just saying in terms of IPLD prime might be useful to have.
Well, my hope was this thing also, without much work, could work for most codecs. In particular, the thing that I ended up deciding that I wanted was, instead of DAG JSON currently does a type assert on links. And if they're a SID link, it does the special case of printing out the open map key string / SID as the string version of that closed map key. And instead I made an interface for links, and I try and say, is this a link that is a that follows this interface? And the interface that I thought was actually reasonable here is that we should parallel all of our other nodes and ask for, can I ask for the representation of this link? And so then a SID link, the representation would be a map whose key is the string / and the value is the string of the SID. But I can have a different type of link system where I have a different link that has a different representation. And so if we say links have a representation, that might also, I don't know, yeah, might trip us up in new and exciting ways, or it might be great.
I actually think that's a very good reuse of the concept of representation. I think I like that.
All right. Is there anything else? No. Then I close the meeting, and yeah, so there will be another IPLD meeting in 2 weeks without me, but probably with other people. So goodbye.